One of Plato's shortest dialogues, but a dialogue well worth reading, and I think well worth reading early on in studying Plato, is called the Ion. And it's called the Ion after the interlocutor with whom Socrates is speaking, this young man who is a rhapsode. We'll talk more about that in a moment. And the question that they're concerned with in this dialogue is, what is poetry? How does it work? Is knowledge involved? Those are really three questions rolled into one. Knowing the nature of poetry tells us something about the nature of the poet, tells us something about the nature of the art of poetry. So asking these questions together is indeed appropriate. Plato himself is going to be putting forth a theory about what goes on in poetry that can be called the theory of divine inspiration or enthusiasm or possession. Plato doesn't think, if we sort of get to the end, that the poet or the interpreter of the poetry actually possesses any knowledge or art or technique or skill in the same sense that other people, like, say, for example, a doctor or a pilot for a ship possesses skill or knowledge. So this should raise some very interesting questions as we're going through this for you. And you want to think about this in terms of Plato's positions on other things. But first, before that, you want to get down what is actually going on in this dialogue. So in this very first portion, what we're going to do is talk about who these guys are, what's going on, this question of the art of poetry or rhapsody in general, and then a few things that I would advise you to look for in this dialogue. Because Plato has built into this, almost sort of like a person setting up an obstacle course, several points where Socrates is going to say something that should be a little questionable, that should set off some alarm bells, raise some red flags, but usually don't in the part of the person who's reading along, and certainly don't on the part of Ion. We want to think about that in part so that we can make the dialogue do what Plato intended it to do, and in part so that we can use it to practice our critical thinking skills, learning about how to analyze arguments well, and in part so we can think about the larger implications this has for our own lives and our own thought. So Socrates should be pretty familiar to most people. He is Plato's main character in many of the dialogues. He was Plato's teacher. He's typically an old man, although not in every single dialogue. And he wanders around, and part of what he likes to do is ask people questions because he wants to know whether indeed they possess knowledge about the things that they seem to possess knowledge in terms of about, you could say, do they really have, is what they're doing really representative of a body of communicable, rational knowledge? So that's a big question. By the way, side note, the poets are one of the old accusers that Plato has Socrates mention in his Apology, saying that the poets are angry with me and have been angry with me for a long time. If you think about this dialogue and what's going on here, you might understand why that is. Who is this guy, Ion? Ion is not an Athenian like Socrates is from Plato. He is actually from Ephesus, which was an important city later on. Pyrrhus came from there and turned it into an interesting little kingdom a number of years later. But at the time that Ion is living, Ephesus is one of those cities that has been conquered by the Athenians. It's part of their empire. They made some claim to it on the basis that it was originally, a colony. So you could think of it as sort of like a protectorate of Athens. And Ion says, that actually cuts me off from certain jobs. You Athenians and Spartans, when you're looking for generals, you don't actually hire people from outside. You just take your own people, and we don't have any foreign policy or war of our own because you're in charge of us, so so I can't go into that field. Ion goes into the field of rhapsody, and what is it to be a rhapsode? It means to be an interpreter of a poet, or of poetry more generally. The rhapsodes were these people who were not writing poetry on their own, not writing new, original stuff. They were going around and they were performing other people's stuff. You could think of them as like the cover bands of ancient Greece. Or, we still do have interpreters who go around, and reenactments and chautauquas and things along those lines, where, somebody might be interpreting Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, right? And they'll look like them, and then they try to talk like them, and they try to give you the impression that that's really what's going on. We have Elvis interpreters. We call them impersonators, but really what they're doing is interpreting. And they'll sing some Elvis songs, and there'll be this Elvis or that Elvis or this Elvis. Maybe they're old Elvis or young Elvis or, just out of the army Elvis. But the idea is that they sort of stand in place of the original artist, and they make their works come alive in a way that a lack of that performance can't do. So, you can read Homer by yourself. That's the way most of us encounter Homer, isn't it? Or you could have somebody who really understands the text and has practiced with it and loves it and feels very strongly attached to it, interpret it for you. And that may mean just reciting it, but reciting it, in a way that brings it across. And it may mean also, commenting on it and saying, here's what he means at this point. Here's, if you think that this passage is important, look at this passage. That sort of interpretation, by the way, is actually what I do in philosophy for the most part. I don't do an awful lot of original work. I interpret Plato, I interpret Aristotle, I interpret Epictetus, because I feel a similar kind of relation. You might say that what we historians of philosophy are, when we're not just, digging around in archives and stuff like that, is we're really rhapsodes of philosophy. So that's what Ion does. And Ion is a rhapsode who specializes in Homer. He tells Socrates, that's really the only guy that I can do. I can't do Hesiod, I can't do Archilochus, I can't do any of these other poets. As a matter of fact, when people are reciting them, I kind of get a little, bored and fall asleep. And when somebody starts reciting Homer, man, I perk right up, and I'm there. I'm attentive. I am with it, and I am, ready to start talking and discussing. And it's that way with a lot of things. Not everybody's into the same kind of music. Not everybody's into the same kind of sport. Not everybody's into the same topics in general. And so that's what he specializes in. Now, Socrates is going to engage in discussion with him, and the question is about, this art that he has. Ion is a successful practitioner. He just won a prize. He's up for winning other prizes as well. The question is, who's giving him this prize? And why is he getting these prizes? He must really know what he's doing if he's getting prizes, right? So if there's prizes are for talent. And talent is based on knowledge, isn't it? Mastery of an art. So he ought to be able to sort of share at any moment what it is that he does. And Socrates will say, hey, can you share it with me? And he says, oh, yeah, let me get ready. All right, I'm going to take my stance. And then he'll start doing his homework. He says, no, Socrates says, no, that's not what I'm looking for. I want you to tell me about this. I want you to explain it to me. So Ion can perform. The question is, can he explain? He definitely can tell you what it is that he's doing, or do it, but can he actually explain to another person precisely why he's doing it that way? What it means that he's doing it that way? And even more importantly, as a criteria for Socrates, can he distinguish good and bad performances, speaking well in others? You know, you would think if you want a good poet, you should go to the other poets and ask them who's a good poet. Or, you know, if you want to know who's the best interpreter of a particular poet, go around and ask the other people who interpret it and see who they want to listen to in their spare time. And Ion says, yeah, I can tell you about that, at least with Homer. I can't really tell you that well if somebody's speaking well about Hesiod, because that's not my area. You know, and this makes sense. I mean, think about this in terms of philosophy. I'm an Aristotle scholar, so presumably if you bring somebody in and they're talking about Aristotle, I can say this guy's full of crap, or this guy actually knows what he's talking about, and you ought to listen to him because you're going to learn something. But if you bring in somebody who's going to talk about Quine, who I haven't read for close to 20 years, I'm going to be at a loss. You could tell me that Quine was for hamburgers and against hot dogs, and I'd have to say, well, I guess that could be the case. I don't really know. So it works that way with poetry as well, Ion is saying. And Socrates is going to challenge this. Socrates is going to introduce this idea of knowledge that we see in other Socratic dialogues, and he's going to use this to challenge what Ion is presenting himself and his art as doing. And he's going to say, you really don't know what you're doing. You don't possess knowledge. And over and over again, there's going to be a number of different arguments oriented towards this same effect. If the poet doesn't possess knowledge, then what the hell is he doing? How is the poet so successful in arranging language so that it conveys images, arouses emotions, holds our attention, tells a story? That's where the issue of the divine is going to come in. And we'll come to that in a moment. So, what else needs to be said? There's one other thing that I want you to be very attentive to, and that is where Socrates is making arguments that may in fact have some problems with them. The mere fact that Ion goes along with it and says, yeah, okay, I guess that makes sense, that shouldn't be taken as an index that this is always a good argument. Now, why would Plato introduce arguments or positions that are not completely airtight into his dialogues? Is it that Plato himself was taken in by these arguments? That's some people's views. They say, well, Plato just wasn't a very good thinker. He wasn't as advanced as people who came after him, like Aristotle, who would point out these sort of problems or improve upon Plato's notions. Or is what's going on, perhaps, and this is what I'd like to suggest to you, is that Plato wants us to have that sort of alarm bell kind of thing, and then say, well, how could we improve this? How could we think this through in a way that's more adequate to our, say, experience? This is something that Ion will actually bring up. He'll say, well, this doesn't completely jibe with my experience. Or how can we make these arguments better so that they would actually fit the phenomena and make better sense out of it? That's a question that I want to leave open for you. And I would like to suggest to you that, again, that Plato set up these dialogues as kind of training grounds for the life of the mind, and that by engaging in that, you actually become part of the dialogue and engage in dialogue with these interlocutors yourself. After some initial sort of scene setting, Socrates and Ion get down to the real business at hand, which is trying to make sense out of this question. Is poetry a rhapsody an art? And that, for Plato, means, is it a kind of or body of knowledge about a subject matter? So before we go any further, let's think about things that Plato is willing to consider to be an art, at least in these dialogues. Medicine is a prime example, and he's thinking not only in terms of, like setting bones and giving remedies or things like that, but also giving advice about diet, which is what ancient doctors did quite a bit. They would prescribe things for particular people. They knew some general principles about the human body and about the different substances that could act upon it and its processes. And then they could apply those to specific cases. And whether they could be successful or not, that was in many ways the test of whether they knew their field. But there was another test, which is, could they explain what they were up to? Mathematics is another example of an art that gets talked about in here as well. Fishing is an example of an art that will come up a little bit later on. The fisherman actually understands how to properly set the hook, how to bait the hook, how to put it out, where to put it out, what kind of fish to try to go after, how to get the hook, how to make the lures, all those sorts of things. So the question is poetry something like that? And is the interpretation of poetry what we might call impersonation or performance or even literary criticism? Is that kind of body of knowledge? Does it have a determinate subject matter that it is going to grapple with, cover, master, and then reshape? So, Socrates is going to raise a problem with Ion. This starts out seeming a bit accidental, but it's really not. Plato has this arranged this way, in part because he wants to point out a difference between poetry and other arts. So he talks about other people being able to distinguish good sculpture. If you understand the field of sculpture, you ought to be able to tell who is actually doing well, who's doing poorly in it, and be able to critique the works of this sculptor, this sculptor, this sculptor. Same thing with painting, same thing with music. But poetry is a little bit different. In this case, the person who is supposed to be the critic, that is the judge, the krites, the one who is able to interpret and say this is what is really high quality, this is not, is only able to talk about one portion of the field. Ion says, look, I only know Homer. I know Homer really well. I can do a lot of stuff with Homer, but when it comes to Hesiod, I'm out of my league. I can't do that. And Socrates says, well, that's really kind of weird. Would we really consider somebody to be knowledgeable in an art if they only know part of the subject matter? For instance, in medicine, if you only know about cancer, do you really know medicine? If you only know about one kind of ship, do you really understand shipbuilding or piloting? We wouldn't normally say that sort of thing. We would ordinarily say that doesn't really make sense. What you've got there is an immaturely developed practitioner, or somebody who's a specialist in a very narrow field but doesn't actually understand the larger art or science or discipline in which they're engaged. So in a certain sense, they don't actually know what they're doing. They may be good for that application, but they're not good across the board. They're not really an expert. They're not really an authority. They're not really a whatever you want to call them. So it's a little weird, Socrates says, Ion, that you only know Homer. Let's think about this now, he says, in terms of being able to speak well. You can speak well about Homer, right? And speak well, that is, to be able to verbalize, to articulate, to put into words, to be able to make sense out of things, to bring intelligibility, to have other people be able to see what you're driving at, to explain, right? You can explain Homer, you can speak well about Homer. Shouldn't you be able to speak well about all these other people as well? And Ion says, yeah, I guess that would be the case. Now here's where the twist is going to be. Does Homer speak well? Is Homer knowledgeable about the things that he himself is speaking about and talking about? Presumably that's part of the attraction to Homer's works. You know, especially for the ancient Greeks, we tend to read Homer for escapism, or because we're assigned the text, or because we're ancient Greek scholars and we're interested in the world of the ancient Greeks and what this speech in the Iliad reveals about kinship structures or things like that. But the ancient Greeks weren't looking at it that way. They actually treated Homer and Hesiod and some of the other poets as providing them with knowledge about a number of different things. Socrates, says, does Homer treat things that other poets different than all the other poets treat of? Wasn't his subject mainly war? And hasn't he discussed the mutual relations of men, good and bad? So what we could call politics or social relations and ethics. As well as special craftsmen. Doesn't Homer discuss how craftsmen do their jobs? The relations of the gods to each other and to men, that is theology. The phenomena of the heavens and occurrences in the underworld and the births of gods and heroes. Cosmology, genealogy, all these sorts of things. Homer seems to be quite knowledgeable about a lot of things, and that's part of what attracted the Greeks to reading him, to thinking about him. It wasn't just that it was a fun story with Odysseus, shooting arrows into people, or monsters and witches and gods, doing things, and cyclopses. Instead, these are supposed to teach people about life. Not just about their individual life, but about society, about the cosmos. So Homer does speak well, Ion says. That's what I like about the guy. Now, how do you know whether he speaks well or not? Who is the person who is able to speak well? As it turns out, Socrates will say, it's not only the person who's able to speak well on his own account, it's also the person who's able to distinguish who else speaks well or poorly. Who else knows what they're talking about and can communicate it. That's where the trouble is going to arise. Because if we take Homer has to be expert enough to know whether other people are speaking well or poorly. And now if we take Ion needs to be able to know whether other people speak well or poorly about these same subject matters in comparison to Homer. But can he do that? He says, when it comes to the other poets, I'm out of my depth. I don't think they speak as well as Homer because I respond to Homer. But that's not the same thing as having a criteria for who speaks well or poorly. A doctor, for example, not only can tell you, hey, you gotta quit eating this and lose some weight, and then your diabetes might come under control. A doctor can also listen to somebody else and say, well, that person's full of it, or that person's actually on the right track. And why are they able to do that? Because they know their subject matter. Ion doesn't have that capacity. So what does that mean? That means that he doesn't have a kind of knowledge. If there is an art involved in rhapsody, or even in poetry itself, as we're going to see, it's got to be something else. The question is, does he possess art or knowledge in any sort of strict sense? And Socrates is going to say, well, clearly, Ion, you don't actually have knowledge. And so Ion is going to say, well, that's weird. How am I doing what I'm doing then? How do I actually communicate effectively? How do I speak well about Homer, who himself speaks well about other things? How is it that I actually, get up on stage and people don't say, get off a stage, you dummy, you don't know anything? How does that occur? That's where we get into the next portion, which is this metaphor of the rings and the magnet. We arrive now at what many people take as being the most important part of this dialogue, which is Plato's articulation of the theory of poetry and its interpretation as something like divine inspiration or ecstasy, which is an aesthetic theory, a metaphysical theory, and you could say an epistemological theory, all rolled into one. And there's a metaphor that's being worked out here. That's why I've got this little diagram here, and we'll come to that in a moment. Socrates is going to say to Ion, well, look, if you don't have knowledge, then what is actually going on? You're not able to speak meaningfully about the entirety of the art of poetry, about the different subject matters that it covers. Why? Because you can't talk about the different poets. You can only talk about Homer. So, leaving aside for the moment the question whether Homer himself is knowledgeable or not, the question is, what is actually going on? Why are you getting this approval from the crowds? Why is it working? Why are you getting a response if, strictly speaking, you don't actually know what you're doing? Ion says, well, that is really strange, isn't it? Because, I get up here and I thought I knew what I was doing. I feel like I know what I'm doing. But apparently, according to you, I don't. And I don't see any way out of this dialectic. He doesn't use that term. But you can picture Ion saying this. I'm really puzzled. I don't see a way out of your line of argumentation. And there's a point that we're going to come back to shortly here. But what I want to stress is that Socrates is going to go through this, and he's going to compare this to a number of different skills and arts, even within what we normally call the fine arts, where poetry would seem to fit. And then he says, look, here's what's going on. It's something like the magnet. How does a magnet work? Well, it has a force, magnetic force that draws things. It's attractive, right? Now imagine a magnet and a bunch of steel rings. What's really cool about a magnet, as you probably discovered when you were a kid and started playing around with these, besides the fact that they repel each other and stick to things, is the fact that they can transfer that magnetic force to other things. The force can flow through another piece of iron, and that can actually become magnetized itself. For the moment when the iron ring touches the magnet, it becomes, so to speak, an extension of the magnet. And it is able to exert magnetic force itself. Another ring can be suspended from it. And another ring from that ring, because the same thing occurs in this case. Socrates is going to say that this is a model for how poetry and interpretation of poetry and audience response works. The magnet is the god or the muse. Pick whatever god you like from ancient Greece. Pick whatever muse you like. They inspire the poet. They transfer that magnetic force. And notice the magnet doesn't lose any of its force in doing so. Likewise, the god doesn't lose any divinity in bestowing a certain amount of that on or in or into, however you want to conceive of it, the poet. The poet thereby becomes an interpreter of the god. And I'm just going to read a few lines because I don't want to pass over some of this great examples that he says. He says, just as from the lodestone a mighty chain hangs down of choric dancers, masters of the chorus, under masters, obliquely fastened to the rings which are suspended from the muse. So I've oversimplified here a little bit. One poet is suspended from one muse, another from another. We call it being possessed. And from these primary rings, the poets, others are in turn suspended, some attached to this one, some to that, and are filled with inspiration, some by Orpheus, some by Musaeus. But the majority are possessed and held by Homer. And you, Ion, are one of these and are possessed by Homer. And whenever anyone chants the work of another poet, you fall asleep and haven't a thing to say, but when anybody gives tongue to a strain of this one, you are awake at once. Your spirit dances, and you have much to say, for not by art or science do you say of Homer what you say, but by dispensation from above and by divine possession. So Ion himself is one of these rings in a chain. He is an interpreter of God or the gods, of the divine. And you can look at it in going this way, and you can look at it going this way. We sort of trace our steps back this way, but the metaphysical, ontological way in which things are working is this way. The gods are not imparting knowledge to the poet. They're imparting something, in a certain respect, better than knowledge, but also in a certain respect more unreliable, right? Because it's dependent on the god providing that and keeping that there. And perhaps it's hard to understand if you're not yourself inspired by the god. That's where the rhapsode comes in. There's a lot of people who will say, yeah, I just can't get into so-and-so. But then when you explain it, and you can be any good interpreter, man, it just comes alive for me. That's the job of the interpreter. That's the job of the rhapsode. That's what the audience is looking for in them. And to this picture, you notice I've got all these words up here: inspiration, enthusiasm. I also ought to add possession. All right? Inspiration and enthusiasm really mean the same thing if we're looking at the Greek roots. It's literally to breathe in to another. The gods, the muses, breathe into the poet the capacities, the images, the emotions that the poet has. This is the really interesting stuff right here. Plato says poets are literally out of their mind. They're outside of themselves. That's what ecstasy means. It doesn't mean, getting high on drugs and sitting around saying, oh man, I'm having this cosmic experience. What it means is actually getting outside of yourself, being out there, feeling something different. And in this case, it's feeling emotions, and it's also feeling or sensing images. When you're reading Homer, if you're really reading Homer, and he's having that effect on you, if you're the audience, you should feel things. You should feel Odysseus' longing for home and his frustration at not being able to get there. You should feel Telemachus' sense of what am I going to do with it? I'm stuck in this situation with all these suitors who want to marry my mom, and man, I'm a tough kid, but I'm not going to be able to take on all 50 of these guys, and they're trying to kill me already. What am I going to do? You can think about Circe's longing, or Calypso's longing, or Poseidon's anger, or Polyphemus' barbarity. All these sorts of things. They should produce effects on us. And beyond just sheer emotions, we have images. We're transported to Ithaca, or transported to the fields of Troy, at least if it's Homer. If we're reading other poetry, perhaps we're transported to ancient Rome. If we're reading Catullus, I love and I hate. We are transported to a very intimate setting in which he's feeling these two emotions because he's in love with this woman who really is not worthy of being loved, but he's attracted to her anyway. We could multiply these instances pretty much forever, but you get the point. These things come into play, and they're part of the response of the interpreter and the audience. Ion brings up something really interesting, and Socrates plays off of it. We feel emotions in situations where it really wouldn't be warranted to feel them. When we're at the theater And for them it was the round theater, and they'd watch a tragedy and feel pity and feel fear and feel sadness, all these sorts of emotions. They'd also feel anger too. That was part of what was going on in tragedy, although it's not talked about enough. When we go to the movie theater, we feel those sorts of things as well if we lose ourselves in the spectacle, in the movie. It's got to be a good movie to do that, right? It's got to be worthy of a Homer for us to have more than just a sort of button-pushing response, to feel as if, wow, I'm really coming alive here. But that's possible. And Ion says, yeah, when I recite these verses of Homer, I am literally there at Troy. He's got this great example of when Odysseus unmasks himself before the suitors, and he's going to kill them, these guys who have been despoiling his house and trying to kill his son and trying to marry his wife. And he sets down the arrows, and he draws back the bow that is, only he can actually draw back, that they just used for a contest where he showed them up, and starts letting them fly. One ought to feel a sense of both horror and excitement and elation, and also a sense of satisfaction, I suppose, when that's going on. And Ion says that's what I feel, and that's what the audience feels. That's part of what goes on, and that is happening through this transference. It's not happening through knowledge. It's not happening through an actual art that could be taught to somebody else. It's happening through something like divine inspiration. So it's going to be very contingent. It's going to be very difficult to explain to another person. That is the Platonic theory of art and its interpretation in terms of divine inspiration. All the rest of this dialogue is going to be circling around one other main problem, which is that of showing that poets don't actually know anything by the art that they practice, the thing that they're supposed to be skilled in, only by other arts that they might happen to possess. If this is actually the case, this is pretty damning for poetry. Now, true, the poets get to say, well, we're divinely inspired, but, if somebody takes that away from them, it looks like the poets just don't know anything at all and have nothing to contribute, neither do their interpreters. That's a big problem. And you can wonder at this point, is Plato pushing this too far, or is he, engaging in some sort of irony here himself, and maybe putting this out there as something that he doesn't want to endorse completely? I leave that up to you to think about. There's a key assumption that is being made, and he says it before he goes into this rings and divine enthusiasm passage, and he also reiterates it several times. Socrates reminds Ion of it. And Socrates is putting forth this as something that everybody knows. He says, observe what a trivial and commonplace remark it was that I uttered, something that anyone might know, when I said that inquiry is the same whenever one takes an art in its entirety. Now, what does that mean? That means that every single art is going to work the same way. So that's one key assumption. Every art works the same way. So that means that poetry ought to be like medicine, or mathematics, or boat building, or shoemaking, or cooking, or any other art that you like, where somebody actually has some sort of skill and can explain what they're up to. That may, in fact, turn out to be a mistaken assumption, but that's an assumption that's being used here. A little bit later on, he says, each art has its own subject matter. And we can generalize this into arts have completely different subject matters. What's the import of that? Well, that means that cooking is something very different than, say, medicine. Or piloting a boat is something very different than mathematics. Mathematics is concerned with number. Piloting a boat is concerned with boats and bodies of water, you might say. But, you know, one might object, wait a second, doesn't the pilot actually have to measure something? That's where we start to get into some problems. And, you know, Socrates will actually discuss some examples like this in other places. Plato will discuss examples like this in other places. So I think we need to be a little bit wary here of buying the argument wholesale. But let's say we do accept it by hypothesis just to see where this is going to go. So arts are totally different from each other, even though in a certain respect they're all the same. They're all the same in their basic structure. They're all totally different by having totally different subject matters. So if you know something in terms of weaving, you know cloth and the raw material that you're weaving into the cloth, whether it's, you know, vegetable or hair or things like that. You also understand the loom and its processes. And that's a totally discrete subject matter from medicine. Totally discrete subject matter from political science. Totally discrete from playing music. We could pick all sorts of examples like this. Socrates is going to use that as a wedge against Ion to get him to say that the poets don't really know anything. And this is going to be a big, big issue. So, let's follow out this dialectic. He starts out by asking, what do you know about what Homer's talking about? Can you actually yourself speak well on everything that Homer himself speaks well about? And Ion says, yeah, pretty much everything, because I know Homer. And Socrates says, well, not the things that you're ignorant about that Homer knows about, right? And here's where, remember, what does Homer talk about? He talks about war. He talks about the relations between gods and each other and human beings, so theology. He talks about politics and ethics. He talks about particular crafts. And he talks about a few other things as well. So Socrates is actually going to bring up some examples, and the one that he uses here has to do with the charioteer. I suppose in our time we might say that means being a good car driver, right? And he says, here's a bit of Homer. Thyself lean slightly in the burnished car to the left of them, then call upon the off-horse with goad and voice, with hand give him free rein, and at the post let the near horse come so close that the nave of the well-wrought wheel shall seem to graze the stone, which yet beware to strike. So, you know, good advice. If you're in a race, stick close to the inside lane. As you're going around the turn, get yourself as close to that post as you can, but don't let your wheel hit it. That's basically what it comes down to, isn't it? Now, Socrates says, that's interesting. Now, does Homer know this by the art of poetry? Or does he know it by another art, the art of the charioteer? Ion has to say, well, I guess he knows it by charioteering, by driving. And he does this for a few other examples as well. He talks about medicine, because Homer actually says, here's some remedies for things, here's what you ought to do. He talks about cooking, he talks about fishing, he talks about all sorts of things. And in each case, what Socrates is gradually doing, let me see if I can graphically depict this for you. He's stripping away from Homer all of Homer's competencies. So, we have the poet, Homer. And Homer has created these works, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and a number of other things as well, but you know we only have fragments of those. And in them he talks about war and medicine and horses and politics. And this is probably enough right now, right, for the time being. You can get the idea of what we're doing here. So he knows about medicine, but he knows about medicine from the doctor's art. So that kind of strips that outside of the realm of poetry, right? And horse, he knows that about from the horseman's art. And politics, perhaps. And war, although this is not actually, these are going to be sort of reserved for a while, but you get the general idea. With each thing, Socrates can say, well, does Homer actually know about this because of the art of poetry? Or does he know about it because of some other art? If Homer is doing that, then he is a good horseman, but not a good poet in telling us about what kind of horse to pick, or not to pick, or who knows horses and who doesn't know horses. Or, you know, who's good in medicine and who's not. The poet is having their competencies slowly taken away and shuffled off into other arts. Because remember, one of the basic principles was this. Something that belongs to one art doesn't belong to another art as part of its subject matter. The arts are completely discrete and separate from each other. So Ion, you know, eventually sees where this is going, and he sees that this is going to be a problem. And Socrates says the same thing for you, right? You're not a charioteer, but somehow you're able to talk about chariots. The rhapsode's art is very different than the charioteer's art. So you actually don't have knowledge of these things, and neither does Homer. So he says, by your own account, the art of rhapsody will not know everything, nor the rhapsode either. And Ion says, well, the exceptions are only such matters as that. He doesn't see quite where Socrates is going with this, that this can be applied to any single instance. So what are some of the other possibilities? Ion says, I think that what the rhapsode will know about is the kind of thing a man would say and a woman would say, and a slave and free man, a subject and ruler, the suitable thing for each. That makes sense, because if there's one thing that is the subject matter of poetry, one would think it would be language, right? This won't get him off the hook. Why? Because language turns out to be about these sorts of things. What a man ought to say, how a man would speak well, how a woman would speak well, those are going to be concerned with particular arts. Socrates gives the example of the kind of speech that suits a woman, one who spins about the working up of wool. The rhapsode won't actually know about that because the rhapsode is not competent in spinning wool. That's a different art. If he is competent about that, it's because he possesses that art, not because he's a rhapsode. Likewise for the poet. Same thing for the ruler. That's politics. Or perhaps if you're at war, the general's art. For anybody who is a servant, how a slave should speak. All those menial arts that slaves handled, like herding sheep or things like that. So in every single case, what's going to happen? Socrates is able to strip away more and more things. Finally, they get down to military matters, and he says, are you competent in military matters? Ion says, well, of course, I've read Homer. I can interpret Homer. Homer is competent when it comes to military matters because he is writing, he's using language, about these great military commanders like Odysseus or Nestor, who were looked at as being, brilliant when it came to strategy. Socrates then says, well, that's kind of funny, Ion. If you have a general's art, why aren't you a general? Why aren't you working for us? Man, we could use some good generals. And Ion says, this is where he says, well, Socrates, you Athenians, you don't hire outside help. And Socrates says, oh, wait a second, what about this guy, and this guy, and this guy? Well, look, they're competent, and we hired them even though they're foreigners. We'll put somebody in charge. And Ion then has to concede that he doesn't actually have the general's art. So we end here by Socrates imposing a dilemma on Ion. Here's what the dilemma is, he says. Choose how you would be called for us, whether we should take you as a man unjust because you won't share the knowledge that you have. You're a general, why don't you take up the mantle of being a general? So are you a man unjust, or are you a man divine? That is, are you somebody who carries out his work by inspiration, or are you somebody who knows and is keeping your knowledge from us? It's actually a trilemma. Or do you actually not know anything? So given those alternatives, the poet says, I think I'd rather be the one who actually has some sort of competency that's given to me from the gods, and that I communicate to the audience through that. I'd rather be an interpreter of Homer, who's an interpreter of the gods, and have the divine flowing through me. That's where the dialogue ends. Again, I invite you to think about whether Plato is entirely serious in everything that he's saying here, whether we should take this as being his ironclad last word doctrine about this, or whether he's putting forth these ideas as things for us to bat around and think about and perhaps accept certain parts of but reject other parts of. We also want to think about some of the questionable assumptions that have been made. We want to think in particular about whether poetry really is an art like the other arts, and whether the arts are really totally separate from each other. So if you're doing something by one art, you can't possibly be dealing with the same subject matter from another art. And I would like to suggest one example which takes us outside of this dialogue for when that is the case. And I would suggest that you look at the Gorgias, where the same subject matter is being treated by the doctor and the cook, by the gymnastics teacher and the makeup artist. They're being treated in different ways. So that's where I want to leave you after having gone through this dialogue.